Well, hey there, folks. I'm in the middle of setting my kitchen on fire, apparently, and this is Slow End Computing. So, one of the questions that I get asked quite often about computers is when people just start getting into um, playing around, upgrading, kind of fixing their machines and everything, they go, well, how do you know what that component is? And the answer to that is you usually just have to Google it, or you end up breaking it, and then you learn that way. But to kind of fast track you through that whole process, we're going to go ahead and open up the Slow End PC, and we're going to take a peek at just sort of an overview of the regular components that you'll find in every computer, no matter the performance level to it, no matter the age of it. They're all going to have a certain number of components to them, and I'll show you what they look like on this computer. Let me go ahead and reorient the camera, and we'll get into that. All right, looks like I've got that zoomed in just about as much as I can. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by removing the side panel. Generally on computers, there's a handful of different ways to get into them. There's either two screws, usually located right here and here. You take those off and then the side panel just kind of slides back a little bit. On gaming computers, this side's usually glass, and then it's usually held in by a couple screws on the outside, or what we're seeing a lot now with like the newer ones, same dual screw arrangement back here. Sometimes I've seen them just using the one screw, and then you just take the little handle right over here, push it back, and the whole panel slides off. On this particular computer, which is a Dell Optiplex 7050, this little blue guy right over here, you push down, and then same thing, it just pulls right back, kind of falls out of the way, and we'll just go ahead and set that off camera over there. With these guys, we also have to pull the front panel off of this particular computer. That's usually not something that you're going to have to do on yours, but it is something we're going to have to do with these guys. But once we have that all in place, we'll go ahead and open this side panel up, and you can actually see what's going on with the computer. So right off the bat, don't worry if your system doesn't look identical to this. That's perfectly fine. Computers are going to look a little bit different from model to model, but they're all going to share more or less the same components. So we'll go ahead just from sort of like a ground up introduction to the computer. On this particular one, the component that's lowest to the ground is actually the power supply on these guys. Power supplies will come in all different sorts of shapes and sizes. They're usually like a large box. This particular one's actually kind of long and kind of narrow on there. I think what Dell was trying to do with this one was to make it fit into a bunch of smaller systems, and it just met the power requirements for this guy, so they threw them in there anyway. More often than not, power supplies are going to cut off right about here and then just kind of go to the end of the computer right over there. Most of the time on like home computers, they look very similar to this. On gaming computers, you probably won't see the power supply. It'll be located around the back of the computer. Those back panels come off, and then you'll see the power supply there. And then they'll just have a couple different holes cut around the case for you to sort of push the cables through and then plug them into the motherboard. For whatever reason, gaming computers haven't adopted backside power and all those kind of connectors yet. I've seen a couple companies try, it just isn't as popular. Either way, with these guys right over here, we've got that power supply identified. The next one up on our particular system is a graphics card. These guys, again, will come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes and everything on there, but they're always going to be populating. We'll go ahead and pull this one out so I can actually show it off a little bit better. There we go. So with the power supplies and everything, with the GPUs and everything on there, they're always going to be essentially more or less the same shape. More often than not, they're going to be a little bit bigger than this. This is kind of a small one, but you know, it gets the job done, so we're not going to complain too loudly on it. You'll recognize these guys because they're one of the largest components on the computer that's actually going to have an active cooling fan on there. As GPUs have gotten more powerful, their cooling demands have become a little bit more important to keep into note. So nowadays, other than just the very, very lowest tier of them, they're all going to have some form of active cooling on them. Other than that, they're going to be generally situated right over here in one of these PCIe lanes, generally the one that's closest to the power supply. Depending on your board, that might not always be the case, but it is on this one. Behind the power, gee, why do I keep calling this a power supply? Behind the GPU, sorry about that, you'll have these little data connectors right over here. These are going to be PCI and PCIe Express lanes and everything on there, and they'll come anywhere from the smaller versions all the way up to the larger versions, the X16s on there, and they are essentially the portions of the computer where if you need to add something onto the actual motherboard, not necessarily speaking like RAM or drive, but like actual like components. GPUs are probably the biggest ones that we use today, but you can see different like networking cards, you can see different communication areas on there. Back in the day you'd have like sound cards and everything. They all make use of the PCIe slot because that gives them more or less a direct communication up into the CPU. So they don't have to navigate things like SATA or USB. It's just a lot more flexible, and it offers a whole heck of a lot more data communication as well. To just kind of moving up from there, you'll always find one of these somewhere on your motherboard. This is your CMOS battery. Computers and everything have many different areas of storage to them, whether it's storing your photos, whether it's storing your operating system, whether it's storing the short-term memory of your computer on the actual RAM, or whether or not it's storing the actual system preferences and sort of the notebook that the computer needs to kind of dial itself in and turn on every single time on there. They'll be scattered throughout the system, and all this CMOS battery does is it keeps the circuitry responsible for the presets on the BIOS alive and active. The BIOS is always going to be there, and unless it gets physically damaged or corrupted somehow, you're going to have something there. The reason why this battery needs to maintain power to it is every time you turn your computer on, it has to know certain things to be able to function properly. It needs to know the system time, it needs to know where it's looking for a drive, it needs to know what it can do and what it can't do depending on how your network is set up. With this little battery, all it's really doing for us is maintaining the system time, so we don't have to type that in every time we turn the computer on, which is nice to have, so we'll make sure to keep a battery in there. Moving up from there, you'll see this little unit right over here. This is this computer's excuse for CPU cooling. It's not very elaborative, but to be fair to the computer, it doesn't really need much, and this system never overheats. So even though it's not much to look at, it does just fine. But this is your CPU cooler. Multiple different shapes and sizes on there, but for an introductory purpose, this is probably what yours is going to look like. They're usually this giant metal, like a flower looking guy, and they've got a fan screwed right on top of them. With these guys, they're essentially just downdraft coolers on there. The fan will spin, forcing air through the fan, through the little CPU heat sinks, and then just kind of wash over the motherboard, and then it gets sucked out by this exhaust fan over there. Pretty darn basic. It just relies on the metallurgical properties of, in this case, aluminum, to take the heat away from the CPU and sort of radiate it through those fins and then get cooled by the air rushing through it. Very simple, it works very fine. On more powerful systems, you'll usually see things like a tower cooler, where it's essentially one of these guys on its side with a couple of heat pipes running through essentially another heat sink that's been attached to the CPU, and then running through a different set of fin stacks on there, which allows more air to move through it this way instead of going down that way. The plus side to that is you do get a little bit more airflow, you do get a little bit more surface area to be able to cool actively. And nowadays some of the even bigger ones will have like dual fin stacks on them with like a fan either sandwiched in between or have like one on each side of the fin stack to really move a lot of air through there. There's not much downsides to that. One of the ones that you could complain about if you really want to split hairs is with a tower cooler, you're not going to have that downwards cooling on there. You're not going to be able to cool off all these little capacitors, all these little chokes and everything around the motherboard. In certain applications, you do need to cool those. However, it's been my experience that if they needed to be cooled, they would be sandwiched underneath a large aluminum like heat spreader for them. If your computer doesn't have one of those, don't worry about that. That's not a big issue. That's just that's per computer basis on there. This computer doesn't have any heat sinks or anything on those chokes or capacitors. Hey, there we go. There's the stove. All right, we're not on fire yet, but I do need to move through this video pretty quick. This one doesn't have any heat sinks, so it should be good to go on that. It does have downward facing cooling, so anything that's on the motherboard can benefit a little bit from that cooling on there. I don't think it would really need it though, so that's something to keep in mind on there. If you do like an upright tower cooler, it's not going to have that. Other types of coolers are like AIOs and everything, and I'll try to do like a separate video just showing the pros, the cons, and the different styles and what they look like, so y'all can kind of have an idea of what's going on. This is just supposed to be a very quick overview on there, and I think we've covered the CPU and CPU cooler. Adjacent to that, right next to it, you'll see the system memory. More often than not these days, it'll be just to the right of that. Sometimes you'll see them below, sometimes you'll see them above, but this is kind of becoming more of the accepted industry standard on there. These guys are essentially just, there we go. You can identify these guys just by the fact that they're almost always rectangular on there. They're almost always this exact same size. They're about the size of a decent bookmark on there. More often than not, you'll see them with metal heat sinks attached to them. We've done some testing on this channel about that, and it does actually increase performance a little bit. Depending on scenario, it probably isn't needed. So if your computer has it, fantastic. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. One thing to definitely keep in mind though is if your computer only has a single stick on there, you are missing out on a bit of performance on that. So if you were hoping that your computer would have a little bit more oomph to it, you could always get a second stick of RAM provided your motherboard has an available slot, and that would actually upgrade performance quite a bit. And don't mind that crunching noise. That actually is how you're supposed to put RAM in. But as you saw, they are also keyed. So if you go to put it in one way and it doesn't fit, just flip around and stuff it in the other way, and then boom, there you go. It's going to work every time. A lot of times with computers, you'll see like 4 slots on there. You don't need to populate all of them. As long as your system has enough memory to do what it needs to do, you're golden and you're good to go. There is some debate out there that you should never put 4 in. You should always do like a staggered 2 on there. I tend to raise the BS flag on that. If you need more system memory, there really isn't any appreciable difference between having 64 gigs in like 2 memory, like 2 sticks of RAM versus 64 gigs in like 4 sticks of RAM. There's really no performance difference on that. I know that some people like to die on that hill. I haven't seen any data that would suggest one's more capable or less capable than the other. But either way, that's where your RAM is going to be. That's kind of how it's situated on there. We'll have a couple of videos coming later on to show you what that does and what types of RAM you might need. But for the purpose of this one, that's the location, that's what it looks like. Moving on from that, we get into the actual storage of the computer. Don't mind that this one has a penny taped to it. We do have a video on that. I will be posting that here sooner rather than later. Don't do that to your drive, but as you'll see in that video, it does actually help. What this penny is doing is it's just acting as a heat sink, and you'll see that on like larger high capacity drives or higher transfer speed drives. They'll almost always have an aluminum heat sink glued to the top of them. We replicated that with a penny. I did not think it was going to work. It worked fantastic. But either way, this is your storage these days. Back in the day, you would actually have like large, here, we'll go ahead and unplug this one so you can see what I'm talking about. Because this computer does actually have 2 of them on there, if I can remember how to pull it out. There we go. Back in the day, hard drives used to look like this. They were enormous. This is about the size of like an actual quality sandwich on there. Massive, massive spinning platters. You'll still see these around quite often. They're usually used for like backup, or you'll see them a lot for just additional storage, which is what this computer is doing. It has one fast primary drive where the operating system and everything is stored, and then it has a slower, more larger capacity drive for saving larger files. In this application, it's used for saving games and everything on there. But this one works well enough. It is just quite a bit slower, and on this particular model, it's kept off to the side in this little door right over here. Let's see if there we go. But this is going to be much more typical of what you're seeing today. These newer drives are really only about the size of like a stick of gum. They go in their own specialized connector on there, and they literally just lay down flat by the side of the motherboard. There's nothing really to them on there. Once you get them attached and you get your operating system installed on them, you're good to go. Nowadays, with more modern computers, and especially with more like gaming oriented computers, I've seen these guys are more often than not down here. They're very rarely tucked off to the side. I'm not sure why Dell chose to do it that way. But for most of the computers, they're going to be tucked down over here. On the really high-end stuff, they'll be underneath like a giant aluminum heat sink that kind of spreads across the board and everything on there. You may need to check your manual if you're looking over your motherboard and you're just not seeing them, but you do see like large aluminum like shielding and everything. It's probably underneath one of those, but before you start unscrewing those, check your manual, check and see what it says. I've seen a couple boards that say, hey, the M.2 is under here, and M.2 is this connector right over here. It's referring to that size of pinout and connections on that. You could have either like M.2 SATA and M.2 NVMe, but the overall pinout and shape is referred to as M.2. The length and size of the drive is referred to as something else, but again, we'll have videos discussing those later on. They just haven't been created or posted yet. I'm trying to even these out instead of just dumping like 100 or so videos all at once. So keep tuned if you're here early. Either way though, that's going to be where the drive is on this computer. Your drive is probably going to be somewhere down here if you're looking for it. Other than that though, that's pretty much all of the major components of the computer. The motherboard is of course this giant green thing that takes up the entirety of the back side of the computer. It hosts everything that gets plugged into it. You're plugging it into the motherboard. But once you have those components in place, you've pretty much got a computer. Everything else is just the different cabling and everything on there for plugging in, getting it hooked up for additional things like CD drives, things like hard drives and all that good stuff. Those will be plugged into separate connectors on there. We'll have videos going about how to hook those up and how to get those connected. But other than that, that has been pretty much the standard overview for a computer. That's what it looks like on the inside. That's what those components do. That's more or less where they're at. If you've got any questions, I'll be trying to keep an eye on this video because I know I'm going to be referencing it to a handful of folks. So if you do have questions, leave them in the comments and I will try to get back to you. Other than that though, thanks for watching.